Howdy, Rockstars. Welcome to our first webinar for Rockstars of Drums. I'm Lid Shaw from Recording Studio Rockstars.com, and you rock for taking this course. So really psyched to have you here. If you're joining us or on the live webinar, then please feel free to use the chat window right here on YouTube, and you can drop your comments in or questions along the way. And if you're watching this as a replay, then I hope you enjoy it. I had a bunch of great questions come in, submitted through our question form. I'm just going to kind of flip through them and do my best to answer them right here on this webinar. It's just kind of creating bonus content to go with the course. This is the first one I'm doing. It's a good chance we'll be doing more of these in the future. So if you've got more questions, feel free to email me at any point at lidge@recordingstudiorockstars.com. And you can just send in your questions to me about recording, editing, or mixing drums. And I'll include it on our next webinar if it doesn't go into a new module for Rockstars of Drums, because I want this to be a great resource for you to learn tons about it. I want to make sure we got a real community and dialogue going too. So if you also would love to see any more of like a forum or like anything on Facebook or a tool like that would maybe just help everybody chat a little bit or be able to turn in your drum recordings, do that. If you want to send me an example of your drums that you're using along the way, I would love to hear it. I've gotten some great examples in. A shout out to Mike Kuntz sending in a mix to me, which I'm going to be listening to right after this. I had to get ready for this, so I haven't heard it yet, but I'm really excited to hear that. Also a great song from Patrick Hakes around Christmas time. Love that one. Thank you for sending that in, using the Lidge Man technique for recording your drums. And then Bobby V sent in an amazing mix. So I'm going to actually include that in examples for all of you to hear, because it's just so good. So thanks very much for doing that, guys. And girls, feel free to send in anything you've got at any point. I want to hear it. Again, this is a place for you to record the best drums you can. So whatever we can do for that. So let's just jump right in. I've got some questions. I got a little slideshow put together, and I will show you guys the questions and the answers that I've got for it. And we'll kind of get through this as fast as we can. So bear with me while I do a little screen share here. And if you are having trouble seeing this or hearing it, make sure to let me know. But I think we're going to be good to go. And I think you should be seeing my first screen right now. So here we are in Rockstars of Drums, first Q&A webinar. And these are all questions that have come in from you, Rockstars, and I will do my best to answer them right here on this webinar. So, whoops, that didn't do it right there. So let me go to the next one. There we go. All right, cool. So this first question comes in from Mark, and Mark asks a little more of a statement or a general thing, but he just says, you know, before recording comes tuning and selecting, also pitch. Any insight would be appreciated. So that's a great question, and that could be a pretty deep topic in you know, in general, but I'll kind of talk about some of the things that you really want to think about right now before you're ready to get into, you know, like super high-end drum tuning stuff or anything like that. But basically the very first thing you want to do is you just want to find a great drummer. So the thing that makes drums sound fantastic is 90 to 99%, whatever you want to call it, it's the drummer themselves. So when you have a really, really great drummer, they are going to do everything from hit the drums just right and cause that to have a fantastic tone, to, you know, finding a balance between the different drum levels. They're going to control how the drums sound, everything, the groove, just everything about it. If your drums are feeling great, they're probably going to sound a whole lot better. If they're sounding great, the way the drummer's hitting them, they're going to sound much better when you record them. So always, whenever you can, start with a great drummer. I love playing drums myself, and I will take any opportunity to do it myself. But I know from experience that if I bring in a drummer who's really good, it always sounds better. So that's a great place to start. Next up is selecting drums, and a shout out to Jim Patrick. Hi to you. Just saw you dropped in a comment there. Select the right drums. So if you've got drums in your studio of a variety of choices, then start by just selecting the right ones. I actually have 3 kicks here. I guess I got 4 toms, so 2 different tom choices, probably about 6 snare drums, 6 to 8 snare drums. So not that you all have that, but as far as places to start when you're collecting your drum kit so that you can have different choices, I think the snare is the first place to start having a variety, because snares just sound so different and they can have such a different character on a song, and they can, be mixed as a really big featured element in a song. So I will start by picking out a kit, the kick and the toms that I like. I'll actually work with the drummer first and go select which ones we like in the studio, and then set those up to mic them, unless the drummer brings in their own kit. And then once they're mic'd up, I tend not to move it. It's a lot harder to swap out a kick drum in the middle of a session, or the toms even, than it is to swap out a snare drum. So we tend to stick to those drums once they're in place. But while I'm actually recording and while we go from song to song on a session, that's a great time to try out different snares. So just when you get ready to start learning a new song or playing a groove with it, just have some snares there. If you've got a few snares, take that opportunity to swap them out. Just set them onto the stand really quick. Don't even get crazy with it. Don't worry about tweaking it or anything like that. Just see if one leaps out at you and seems to play better for that groove for that particular song, because that can really make a difference. And sometimes you really can't tell when you're out in the room. I'll go out and listen to a snare, and sometimes it just confuses you because it's just freaking loud. You hit it out there, everything's loud and bright. But you put it on a stand and go listen to it the way you're miking it, and sometimes it translates in a way that's totally unexpected. So every chance you can, take that opportunity to just kind of listen to some different snares. If you got a great thing going, then you're already good to go, and don't bother changing it. But that's something to try. The other instrument that I would swap out is the cymbals too. So I'll definitely listen to different crash cymbals when I'm sound checking. I'll maybe check different rides on different songs. Hi-hats, again, are a little trickier. They take a little bit more time to assemble and disassemble the hi-hat. But it's kind of easy to swap out those other crashes and rides just to see if they fit each song better. So selecting the right drums to start. As far as other treatments of the drums, I feel like that's part of the selection. Like if I want a wide open snare, that's selecting that as a sound. If I want something that's a lot tighter, I might do things like you saw in Rockstars of Drums, like put a wallet on the snare. I might put a, put tape on it. I might actually put a folded up sheet on. I might actually take the sheet and just cover the drum entirely and do like that kind of tea towel sound, that Ringo thing that we did in Rockstars of Drums. Same thing with the toms, because those will make a huge difference in the sound. So those are stylistic choices that you're going to have to make based on it. So now that we're talking about, let's say we've got our stuff, let's say we're not totally treating the drums with blankets, but we want to get more into the basic drum tuning. So there are some simple, straightforward ways to start tuning a drum. One of the ways is you actually can take your index finger and you can place it in the center of the snare drum to dampen it, and then turn off the snares, and then take the stick and go around and kind of lightly, not really loud, but just kind of medium light, tap the drum head up closer to where each lug nut is on the snare, and hold your finger in the middle. So it's the same thing if you play guitar. When you do a harmonic at the 12th fret, you're actually kind of gently muting the string in the middle of the string on the 12th fret of the guitar, but then you still pluck and you get the overtone of the string, but not the fundamental. Same thing with the drum. By gently muting the center of the snare drum or the floor tom. I don't do this on kick so much. You're muting the fundamental of the drum, and it allows you to hear the first harmonic, the overtone, the first octave up when you tap on around, and it makes it just easier to hear what the tuning is. So when you're tapping from lug to lug, you're hearing to see if they sound matched or if some of them sound higher pitched or lower pitched than the others. And what you do is you tap on one and then you go directly across to the other. And if that one sounds a little bit low, then you can give that just a little bit of a tweak and tune it up a little bit to try and match it, and then go to the next lug and tap that and do the same thing and go around and just kind of gently tap them until you get a general sense that they are all sounding pretty matched to each other and nothing's too crazy. You might find it a little challenging at first. It takes some getting used to. It's not like a perfect science either, but you're just generally trying to see if the drum head sounds similarly or equally tightened where each lug is, where it's adding tension, because you can tighten up a drum and have some of the lugs be really high in tension and then others be low, and it might sound bad and you might not know why, but that could be the reason. So that's a great way to just kind of generally check the tuning on the drum. Next thing I want to say, this where I talk about break the head here. This is let me see, I'm trying to figure out how I can do this well. There you go. Break the head is when you're talking about new heads. So that doesn't mean break the drum head that's on the drum. That means if you're putting brand new drum heads on a drum, like a snare drum, first thing you do is you put the head on, you want to make sure you clean the rim of the drum so that there's no crud on there. There's no burrs or edges on the actual drum rim. I might be using the wrong terminology there, but the actual edge of the hoop, where the drum head is laying flat across before it gets tightened down. And then you put on your lugs and you put on the ring across the head and begin to tighten it down, but just a little bit. You're not really making anything tight. You're just making it firm all around so that it's grabbing it. And then you take your fist and you ball it up and you go down and put your fist in the middle of the drum and you kind of lean on it and you just push down on the drum. You're not going to try and break it, but you're pushing down enough that what it does is you'll hear the glue on the rim of the drum head that is underneath the actual drum hoop that you're tightening. That glue will break a little bit. It'll crack, and it's like you're breaking in the drum head. So you do that. It's kind of like stretching a guitar string when you put it on a guitar as you tune it up. Same thing with the head. You're pushing with your fist down on it a little bit to just kind of stretch it out while you tighten it up, and that's going to help the head find its tuning a little bit sooner when you put on a new head, and it's also going to keep it from slipping as you're doing it. So it's like you're already stretching it out a little bit. So that's a thing. Also, when you tighten up a brand new head, you actually want to tighten it. You don't want to go crazy tight. The first thing you want to do is find the pitch of that drum, and that is just getting it about to firm tight on each lug all around so that the drum, now the head feels tightened across there and it's beginning to have a tone, and start there. And then if you want to, go up from there, but don't automatically just start cranking it up and try and like get it super high, especially if you're not sure where it's supposed to be. If you want it to go high, that's great. You can end up there. But you might want to start with a lower or medium tuning and then work your way from lug. So you do one lug, then you go across the drum, do the one across from it, and then move up one from there, do that lug, then go across and do the lug from there, and then move up one from there, and then go across the drum head. So that way you're always like evening out the tension on the drums. And then this last bit right here, higher on bottom. I didn't write that down very well, but what I meant is the top head and the bottom head of a drum, particularly a snare drum. Typically, you're going to have a thicker drum head on the top of the drum where you're hitting it, and it might be coated. It might not be coated. You might have like a little hitting a circle in the middle of the drum where the stick is hitting, but that one is typically going to be at a pitch of kind of what the tone of the drum is going to sound like. And then the thinner head underneath on the bottom is typically always tuned higher than the top one. And I feel like, you can experiment with a little bit to see how high you want it to tune, but it just tends to do that even if it's a similar tension, just because it's a thinner head. So just so you're aware of that. So what you do is you turn off the snares on the snare, and then, like I said, you can mute the bottom head that's thin with your hand, and then that way you can just tap on the top head so that you can hear what the tuning of that note is, and then flip the snare over, and again with the snares off, mute the top stick side, And so now just the bottom thin head that's clear usually is looking up at you, and you can tap on that one with your stick and kind of hear how it sounds. And you can still go around and like tap the different lugs. It's going to be harder to do because the snares are still like laying on it. So it won't sing as easily as the other one does, and it's harder to kind of double check it, but that'll just give you a sense of how the pitches are different between the top head and the bottom head. And it was a great story I got from one of my mentors when I started out, where he was describing heads that you put on a snare drum, and he told me you just need to get what did he say, like an ambassador on the top and a diplomat on the bottom. And I had no idea what he was talking about. And I just thought it was like some kind of weird sex joke. So it turned out to just be the names of the different drum heads. But if you can get an ambassador, a coated ambassador on top of your snare and a clear diplomat on the bottom, that's a great starting place for a rock snare drum. So those same things I described for snare would all apply to floor toms. As far as a kick, I'll go to the next one here. I like to sit down in front of the kick drum. So I'll have the drummer sit at the kick. I might start by playing it myself. I'll go over to the kick itself and I'll just take my foot and kind of stomp on the kick pedal and hit it a few times, see what it's sounding like. And then I'll reach down and I might tweak the drum heads a little bit on the beater side. And basically you just want it to be tight enough that it's got a nice snap and attack to the sound. You can try tuning it up and down and see what it sounds like, but generally I think I go for something that just seems about right for the tuning of that drum. I'm not trying to do anything really tricky with it. But I find I get more action out of the resonant side. So then I'll have the drummer sit down on the drum set and I'll go around to the front of the kick drum and I'll sit on the floor. So that's why I put this here, sit in front of the kick. And then I'll take the drum key and I'll have them play and I'll try tuning and tightening and I'll do the same thing. I'll tune one lug and I'll go across and tune the other, bring it up. I might tune them all down a little bit and then start bringing them up and listen for where the tone of that kick is and look for something that just seems to work for the way they're playing it and the way they're, this song is sounding. And then I will use dampening like I showed you in Rockstars of Drums, where I'll have a couple of little throw pillows with me. I'll have some sheets or blankets or something like that. And I'll just lean them gently up against the head in different ways. I might take smaller sheets, bits, because if you want to put one inside the kick, if you don't have enough stuff inside the kick and you want to add something, sometimes it's, you bring something really big and you can't get it through the hole. So it might be more useful for you to have some smaller squares of sheet or blanket that are kind of cut out so that you can easily slide them in there and just add a little more as you go. But just feel free to trust your ear at that point. Just sit down and listen in front of the kick. Kicks are not usually too loud, so it's not going to kill you to just sit in front of a kick while a musician is, a drummer's hitting it and kicking on it. It will kill you to sit in front of a snare while they're doing that, but you can get away with it with a kick. And if it's still too loud, feel free to get those gun muff ear muffs. Those what are they? Belden are like the 40 dB ones I think I've got, or 20 dB, 29 dB. I'll see if I can put a link in to those somewhere, but you can just go on eBay, Amazon, anything, and just find gun earmuffs, and you just put them on your head. You can sit comfortably right in front of a drum set and really listen to a drummer playing and hear what's going on with each drum and not feel like you're getting blown up. All right, so two heads or one. This is talking about the kick drum. What kind of kick drum sound are you looking for? If you want to get like a 70s country vibe, if you want to get something that sounds maybe like old funk, or something that's just really tight. Let's say you're recording drums in a really dead room, and you're trying to go for that kind of drum machine sound. In that case, you may want to just do one head on the kick drum because it gives you a lot more control, and you might be looking for a low end just thump that goes away very quickly, so it's really tight and controlled, and you don't want a front head that's ringing or resonating. So that's a good time for you to check out a single head. Every time I put the kick drum in my dead room here at the studio, which I call the phone booth, we walked into it on Rockstars of Drums, I think, but we didn't actually, I don't know that we recorded drums in there. But that one is, I will always do a single front head. I'll always just put one head on, just immediately take the front head off. I'm saying that backwards. I'll keep the beater head on. I'll take the front head off. So that way there's nothing ringing. And then I always put in some blankets and pillows because I'm getting that one mic in there closer, and it allows me to turn that kick up and also compress it and kind of, hype the sound of the kick drum more. But as a result, I always have to deaden it with blankets and pillows and things, because otherwise the tiniest bit of sustain sounds like an 808 kick just going like doom, by the time you've actually recorded it and got it cranked up in the speakers. And then last but not least is just right here is just trust your ears. Literally, like, get used to going out there. Again, if it's too loud for your ears, get some gun earmuffs on, put those things on, and then just sit out at the drum set and listen to the different ways you hit it and what it sounds like. And if something sounds good to you, then it might be good. If it sounds bad, or if you've got a weird boing or something like that, then just keep working on it. This toms, floor toms, even rack toms, those are common places where I find that there's a weird boing going on, some weird sound in the tom sound. And I don't really know what to do about it a lot of times, except that I know that it doesn't sound right. So let's just do stuff to it. So we just start messing with it until I'm in the control room and I hear the drummer tweak it, and all of a sudden it went away, or that sounded pretty good, or they just hit it well once and that sounds pretty good, and I just jump right on the talk back and let them know it's like, hey, that's sounding great, so let's move on. All right, so thanks for bearing with it. That was a lot of answers to that first one, but let me take us to the next question. All right, this one comes in from Dennis, and Dennis says, I'm a total noob about live recording, so as a home recording startup, where do I start? How much should I invest in one of those 8-piece drum miking setups? I saw one that looked pretty comprehensive on Sweetwater. Get almost all of my gear. So Sweetwater, of course, is a great resource for buying audio gear. It's easy to just buy it and have it shipped there for about $1,500. The Audix DP7 plus drum package with stands and cables, right? And I found that too, and that was a great deal. So I've got a few answers to that, and I would say that drum mic kits are great. So if you are starting out and you don't have mics to record drums with, well, what's your goal? Well, your goal is to be able to record drums. So there's no harm in buying a kit where you kind of start out with everything you need and go for it. Because if your goal is to be recording drums as soon as possible, then go ahead and take advantage of the fact that somebody else has made some of the decisions for you, and just get those mics. They're bound to sound pretty great. You probably got, like I said, a huge part of getting a great drum sound is going to be the drummer. And there's going to be so many things that are out of your control and that don't have to do with your mics that, just having a good way to start out is a great choice. There are a number of choices out there. Just going on Sweetwater, I think I immediately found the drum kit from Mic Tech, which I use here, is $14.99, and that included, I think, kick, snare, overheads, a whole collection of mics, and tom mics, so that you can mic up the whole kit. Plus, the Mic Tech tom mics have the built-in clip, so you don't need to use stands for those, which is really cool. Audix also had a mics only version that was only like $4.99, I think, so that was a great deal. And then again, the DP7 that you found, I found it looked like it was only like 1,000, almost 1,100 what I saw, and that I think included. Oh, I see. Right, that was without the stands and mic cables. And then Shure also had another kit. So those are just some general quick looking at prices and stuff like that. I mean, they may be different by the time you see this, but feel free to look around for those. This package from Audix DP7 Plus included mics plus stands plus mic cables. So it's giving you a bunch of the stuff you're going to need, because obviously if you want to do it individually and break it down, you're going to need a kick drum mic, which I like the AKG D112. There's many other options, and there are many good ones. The Shure SM57 is a great choice for snare. It's just something that's been used on snare for a long, long time. Not everybody loves it. I have guests on the show who despise it. It's a dynamic mic, which I think is appropriate for rock because it can really soak up the level of the snare, but it doesn't have a lot of top end to it. It's so if you want a real sizzly high end, you may want to go with a condenser or something like that. A couple of great mics that I really like, the Roswell Pro Audio Mini K47s. Roswell is actually a sponsor on the podcast because they're making fantastic microphones. And the Mini K47s make for really excellent overheads for drums. I've got a video that it's coming out very soon, actually. By the time you see this, may already be out. But I did a review of the Mini K47s, and I used them to record everything in the studio. And they definitely do a great job of recording overheads on the drums. I think one of the things I like about them is that they don't sound hyped up in the high end. So they're real smooth sounding on cymbals and everything. And they were a great choice. So I'm happy with those. And then I'll also use the Mic Tech PM10s, which are the clip-on tom mics. I use those all the time in my studio. So the clips themselves sometimes give me a little bit of a challenge, but I think that might be true of all tom clips because you are relying on a physical thing that's hanging off the edge of a drum and it's getting put on and taken off all the time. But you can always just, put the mic on a stand if you need to. So this is a combination I use when I'm doing them all myself. This is already going to bring you, you get 2-3 of these and you get a couple of Shure SM57s, one for the top, one for the bottom, and you're getting close to $1,000 right there just buying mics individually. Then you would have to buy mic stands, and if you want to do I recommend you can get the clip-on tom mics because that really saves you a lot. You could also, I don't know if anybody's making a clip-on for an SM57, but I usually put my 57s on stands. And you're going to need a pair of stands for the overheads. You're going to need small stands for going inside the kick drum, a couple for the snare. You'll need another one to go out for your ambient mic in front of the kit if you want to put like a condenser or a ribbon mic out there. And if you want to have a couple of room mics, you're going to need a couple of stands for that. So you're already needing like 5 to 8 stands to buy individually if you do that. And at $20 a piece, that's $100 to $150. And then oh, right. This was an answer to part of the question that, who was that, Dennis? Yeah, Dennis had asked. I didn't include it up there, but he was actually asking about getting mics for his own home studio, but then also talking about wanting to bring mics to a commercial studio. So, Dennis, your situation might be unique. From my perspective, if you go to a commercial studio, the reason you're going is because they've got great mics. So you should not need to show up with any mics for a commercial studio gig. However, you might want to if you have a few specialties. Let's say you've got a ribbon mic that's a favorite and you always love to use it. Or let's say you've got some vocal mics you really love. Feel free to bring those to a commercial studio. Another thing to remember about bringing your own stuff to a commercial studio as an engineer or as a producer is it might put you in a really good light with your clients. So if you're bringing it because it really does sound great and you choose to use it on your client's record as a choice to get a great sound, and then that client sees that you went above and beyond, you guys booked the studio, but you still brought us this special tool, that can be a really good choice. Beyond that, I don't think you need to burden yourselves with bringing tons and tons of stuff to a commercial studio because it's just going to be a big pain in the butt, and you're just kind of hauling a bunch of stuff around, and you may have your hands full just kind of getting to know the studio well. So, all right, I hope that helps answer a little bit about selecting mics and dealing with mic kits. My vote is thumbs up for a drum mic kit if you want to start that way. But again, that's not how I started. Although I don't know that they really had mic kits as much back then when I started because it wasn't as home studio focused. But if you want to do it like I say, the individual way, I would highly recommend starting out with just a pair of these, which are $2.99 a piece. These mics you can already use as overheads on the drums, but then you can move them around. You can use it for vocal, bass, guitars. On my demo, I used it for drums, bass, guitars, acoustic, pedal steel, and lead and harmony vocals, and it sounds great. So that might be a good way to get started building your drum collection with a more versatile mic. And same thing with the SM57s. Those double as excellent choices for electric guitars, even acoustic guitars. So between that and the Mini K47s, you've got like mics that you could use on just about every instrument in the studio. And then the D112, same thing. You can use that for your kick drum. You could also stick that on a bass amp if you want. You know, especially if you're recording drums and other overdubs separately. So that's one way to look at it, you know, give yourself some versatility. All right, so next question comes in from Darko, who sent some great comments. Thank you, Darko. I appreciated all your comments, even your criticisms. I really appreciate that. And I have totally moved forward to step up the game on video quality here for future stuff. So I appreciate all of you guys bearing with our initial start in Rockstars of Drums, using some really simple video techniques. For future courses, I went ahead and invested in a really high quality camera. So it's going to be pretty exciting to get into that stuff. But Darko's got a question here about specific solutions. Just this is sort of general topic stuff, how to salvage drum recordings that have gone wrong. Initially, let's say you're mixing and they didn't sound good, or maybe you just recorded it yourself quickly and they don't sound as good as you want them to. Kick recorded too dull because of dampening cloth, cymbals too harsh because of microphone proximity. I think you mean just like if mic's too close on the cymbal, you know, et cetera, what kind of stuff. So I figured I'd jump in and just talk about a few things. Let me take some of my water here. All right, so one of the challenges with kick is you may start out with kind of a boxy sounding kick, because when you stick a mic in a kick drum or even in front of a kick, most mics in most cases start out by sounding kind of boxy, you know, and they're going to require a little EQ to get it to sound right. If you're going for a kind of an old school sound, or maybe even a Motown thing, you might want to do less. You might want it to sound a little bit more boxy and natural. But in general, I think you're going to find that these will help. So first thing I'd like to look at is pulling out some of the low mids in the kick. My theory is that the resonance, if you think about a room has standing waves in it and it has resonant frequencies. So does a kick drum inside. And you're sticking a mic right inside the kick drum. Have you ever put a mic in the kick and before you put in any dampening, it sounds like a basketball to you? That's because the mic is picking up all that sound bouncing around inside the kick. And so when you put dampening in there, that will cut down on the basketball effect and make it not sound so boingy, but you still have the resonant frequencies from inside the drum. And this is my theory anyway. I don't know if it's exactly right, but generally speaking, anything from the 150 to the 300 range might be kind of where the boxy, woofy, not good sound of the kick drum is. And all you need to do is create like a bell curve or a notch filter, maybe not an extreme notch filter, but just like a high Q filter to begin to start pulling back on those frequencies. So you can start by taking the frequency and giving it a high Q and boosting a little bit, and then just kind of sweep around between 150 and 300 and see if you find a part of that that just sucks. Just look for something that you're like, wow, that really sounds pretty bad. And then just reverse that, you know, pull it back and start subtractively EQing that to see if that really helps. And what you'll notice is you can find that it starts to help. You could even go extreme if you want. And when you pull out those low mids and then start boosting the level of the kick drum, all of a sudden you're like, wow, this is starting to actually sound like a really big, tough, tight, modern kick drum sound. You'll notice that there's more low end because you're allowed to push it up and louder now. And you'll notice there's more attack and high end because you're pushing that up as well by sucking out all this lumpy, boxy stuff that isn't really, you know, the powerful, deep stuff you want out of a kick drum anyway. When you take mics on kicks and you begin to move them away into the room, I feel like it kind of does that naturally. You get a little bit more of the low subs. You begin to notice that if the drum's really putting it out there and it's speaking into the room, and you might actually hear more of a slap of the beater when your mic is away from the kick too. But that's just an observation you'll probably pick up on with your room mics and ambient mics and stuff like that. Harsh overheads. So again, if you got a stereo overhead track, feel free to just use EQ, a stereo EQ, to begin to pull back the upper mids. If that's where the harshness is, if it's anything from like 1K up to 5K or 6K, there's plenty of harshness in all throughout that range. 2K is definitely harsh, 3K, 5K. I mean, they're all the Ks, right? So feel free to explore around there and pull things back a little bit. If you look, you could try a high Q, which is like a narrow EQ curve. Boost that a little bit and sweep it and look for anything that just seems to kind of sound nasty to you. And then you could back that off slightly. But I wouldn't do extreme stuff unless you've got a real problem. But another thing to do is, if you are finding that you've done what you can with EQ and that's not really solving it, or there's certain elements or instruments that are kind of killing, they're bringing out a harshness when you don't want it, whereas everything else was sounding good, you could try using like a multi-band. Oh, I put multi-band EQ. I apologize. That's supposed to be multi-band compression. But it's good that I put that, because that reminds me of what I wanted to say. You could do multi-band compressor right here, or you could do a dynamic EQ. And I actually haven't explored dynamic EQs a lot. I've been hearing a lot about them. I'm excited to check it out myself. But I think that those two tools will allow you to arrive at something that's generally working, but begin to handle some of the harsh frequencies when they stick out. I always like to approach a multi-band compressor, and I think about it as basically like, a harshness solver. I put it on when something sounds harsh, and it tends to kind of control it and smooth it. Too much and you lose punch and attack. Other tools you can put across your overheads or across the drums just to kind of smooth it out and warm it up and just give it like a softer tone or whatever is tape. So tape emulators help do that. And then also console plugins, because those tend to put harmonic distortion and saturation on a sound, and that, like tape, will help just kind of smooth out and control a sound. So next up, another problem that you might run into is hi-hat bleed. If you've got a snare drum and the hi-hat is coming through it, you're trying to excite the snare, but it's making the hi-hat go crazy, then you may want to deal with that. Sometimes you don't notice that the hi-hat's going crazy. So this is a reminder to you that when you're dealing with drums, there's a lot of elements here. There's a lot of mics going all at once. You got a lot of fancy mix stuff happening, and you might find that something sucks in your sound and it doesn't sound good. The snare or the hi-hat sucks, and you're like, why does this sound so bad? And you go to reach for the overhead mics and start messing with them, and that doesn't do it. Try muting other things as a first way to explore why something sounds bad. So if your hi-hat sounds bad, begin by muting the snare drum, and because that will tell you very quickly if all of a sudden your hi-hat problem goes away and that's not the problem. It's like troubleshooting. That lets you know, oh, oops, I'm getting this problem with my hi-hat because of the way it's bleeding in through the snare mic and causing all kinds of problems. Another place where cymbals can sound bad is the tom mic. So if you haven't cleaned up your tom tracks, if you're leaving your tom tracks open and you're trying to find just the right balance for them in the mix, sometimes if the crash cymbals or the ride cymbals are in close proximity to those mics, now you have a cymbal that is screaming loud, if they're hitting it that way, coming right back into the rejection zone of the off-axis pickup of that microphone. And if you know this from the podcast, from listening to people talk about this, the off-axis pickup of any microphone, a cardioid microphone, is usually going to deliver the worst sound and the worst phase correlation. So you're screwing with your cymbal sounds by letting them sneak in through other mics. Okay, that's a quick explanation of that. Hi-hat bleed, how to deal with it. Gate or expander on the snare mic to remove some of that hi-hat. You can just do a hard gate and try and set it just right. And then when the snare's not playing, the hi-hat is not coming through. And times where that helps is when you're trying to really compress the snare, or maybe you've duplicated the snare on a second track and you're trying to slam it or squash it or run it through distortion. Put a gate before all that, so that the gate opens when the snare hits, and now that snare is like slamming into whatever that crazy sound is you made, or sending to the reverb or whatever. And that way you won't be doing the same effect to the hi-hat on all the hi-hat notes in between the snare. If the hi-hat's hitting with the snare, well, there's nothing you can do. You're going to hear it through the snare at that moment, but it'll help in all the in-between stuff. Expander is just the expander settings. You've got expansion ratios of, compression would be 2 to 1, but expansion would be 1 to 2, which means, what does that mean? That means that I can't really explain it right now, but if you tweak those settings, think of a gate as like a hard gate. It's like on or off, and think of an expander as more like it's on, but it's not quite on until it crosses the threshold, and then it's on normal, on 1 to 1, and letting the snare through. So I hope that helps and that's not too confusing, but we'll have to get deeper into that with real explainer videos and stuff. Let me see here. Okay, next one. This one comes in from John. So John says, getting that big, tight 70s console, but I know he means console sound with basic plugins and creating sonic signatures using your plugins. Also, some knowledge about what kind of outboard gear to invest in to take my mixes to the next level. Okay, I definitely wanted to jump into the plugin and getting the big, tight 70s sound with plugins. And I think that you could swap any of these things I'm talking about here with outboard gear if you wanted to think about it for mixing, particularly like stuff that happens in the mix bus. So let me just back up. So I figured the best way to describe how to do this in a plugin world, if you want to get a sound that reminds you of like a 70s studio setup, is to just imitate what the studio would have been set up like with the way you're using plugins and your plugin chain and your gain staging at mix. So if you've recorded all your drums into Pro Tools or your DAW, and they've gone in, you got clean sounding drums, but you want them to now sound more like old school 70s kind of vibe, then you might want to set up something that imitates all the same things that those drums would have gone through in a 70s studio. So the very first thing I thought we would talk about is, first plugin is putting a vintage EQ or mic pre plugin on the track. So, and the reason I say put that first is because if you were recording those drums, let's say you recorded the snare in a really clean, with a really clean mic pre. If it was back in the 70s, you might have had like a Neve 1073 or something like that. So you could actually put an emulated Neve 1073 plugin as your first plugin on that snare track, and don't do a bunch of stuff to it. Maybe a tiny bit of EQ like you would have done if you were tracking it in the studio just to your ear to make it sound a little bit better, a little bit of brightness. Maybe you're cutting a little bit of the lows below, I don't know, 100 Hertz, 80 Hertz, something like that, just filtering. But that would have been something you might have done when you were recording that snare drum. So that's a first plugin choice that might make sense. The next thing you would have done is you would have sent that to the tape machine. So I recommend that you don't compress when you're recording your drums and save most of that for the mixing stage, because particularly if you're in a home studio, it's a whole lot easier to have room to try things, push it too far and come back again when you're mixing than it is when you're tracking. If you're in a situation where you really can trust exactly what's coming out of your speakers and you can set things perfectly and feel confident that you can commit to it and stick to that for good, then by all means go for it in the tracking stage. But I have made the big error before of getting overexcited with great compressors. I remember, having a distressor and a 1073 for the snare drum and just going crazy with it when I was in the studio, in a home studio, only to get to mixing with Steve Albini later on in his studio when he was like, your snare's way too compressed. And so he had to like pull out an expander and actually try and reintroduce dynamic back into the snare drum so that it could be mixed properly. So with that in mind, I learned to not use compression when I'm recording drums. However, I will use it in some cases. I will use it on my room mics. I will use it on my ambient mics, particularly on my ambient one out in front of the drum where I'm trying to get that excitement and commit to it. But for most of the drum mics, I'll just cut straight. Next thing, like I said, sorry, I digressed a little bit, but the next thing you would do as you recorded that drum, you go through the mic pre and the EQ, and then you go to tape. So why not put a multi-track tape emulator plugin as the next choice in here? You could put like the Slate tape machine plugin. Waves has got tape emulators. Avid's have got tape emulators. There's all kinds of tape simulators out there. Put one right as your next plugin so that you begin to get a tape sound, and you get some of that tape saturation and limiting that naturally happens when drums hit tape. And I think that you will find that that might be a really cool sound. So then once you've recorded your drums to tape, you've recorded your band to tape, the next thing you would do is you'd take the tape machine and you would press play on the tape and you'd play it back through the console. So now we need a console plugin. So plugins like Slate, VCC, URS make some great console emulators. Waves, NLS plugin. These are all, you know, there's many choices out there now. There's many companies that are making console emulator plugins, but this is a chance to create a plugin, to put a plugin in that takes that sound coming back off tape and runs it through so that you get some of that saturation, you get some of that crunch, you get some of that, a little bit of that EQ curve of the console and that tone. And you know, these are all little things we're doing to add to the sound. So we're not going extreme on any of them necessarily, but adding up all these little things begins to make it sound more like that familiar old school tape 1970s studio setup. Next thing you would do when you're mixing is you're on your console, you're going to want to mix through an EQ. You might have a console plugin that has, you might want to use like, you know, well, the SSL plugins are a little more 80s, I think of, you know, they're still great and you can use them and get great sounds. But if you're trying to go for a 70s thing, you might want to go even earlier than that. You know, you could try using, again, another Neve 1073, 1081, whatever kind of vintage plugin has a tone that you're really digging, but that would be the first thing that you're running through on a console as you're going through the EQ to kind of check that out. And the reason I'm saying add an EQ is because a lot of these consoles, like the Slate VCC, doesn't have any EQ or anything like that. It's literally just like the input stage of the console and how it sends to the summing of the mix bus, which happens later. But an EQ would be the next thing you'd use. Next thing you might use is a vintage compressor. So you might want to try out an 1176 or an LA2A or Fairchild or you know, a DBX compressor or whatever it is that you've got. Try putting a compressor after the EQ and pick a compressor that maybe has a little bit of a tone to it. You know, kind of reminds you of an old school mix. Once you have mixed through that, then you're going to need to hit your mix bus. If you were on a vintage console, all of that sound is going to get summed to the mix bus. And different consoles were famous for having different mix buses that sounded different ways. In fact, Studio A at Blackbird has a Neve console there, and I think it's a 10, it's like an 80 series console, but it has 2 mix buses in it. So they actually installed totally different mix buses just because each one sounds different. So you could choose when you were mixing whether you wanted one that sounded this way or one that sounded a little more saturated and funky. And that's just a reminder that all of these plugins you're using here, like this kind of stuff, often will have the input console stage, and then they've also got an output mix bus console plugin. So you're going to need to put that plugin on at the output stage, which is, I should explain this because people ask me about the 2-bus. So 2-bus is if you have a bunch of tracks in Pro Tools and they're all going to, you know, output 1 and 2, or they're going to bus 1 and 2. You have now an output master fader that is 1 and 2, and that's your 2-bus. That's your mix bus. That is where all the audio is going to mix together and then go out on a stereo pair of outputs. And so that's the one where you'd put a plugin that is your console mix bus plugin. Then if you're mixing on a console, you need to print the mix. So on an old school setup, you would go out of the console and you'd go over to the tape machine, and the tape machine would have, you know, 2 inputs and 2 outputs for you to listen back. So you might want to use a tape plugin right at that point so that it sounds like you printed it to a tape machine and it has that familiar thing. And then that would be the final plugin Technically, I mean, you could always add anything you want, but in a traditional studio, the last thing you do is print it to tape. So that'd be the last plugin you use. And then you would just bounce out your mix from there. And then the mix that's printed in the computer would have the sound of all those things we just ran through as part of the quality of the mix. So I think that's the best answer I've got for how to kind of recreate that 70s studio setup, is literally do what would have been done at that time. I also wanted to point out, don't forget to choose vintage effects, because those will give a quality that is familiar to, and they'll also add the same kind of distortion and noise and stuff that sounds familiar, you know, plate reverbs, chambers, spring reverbs. You know, the Cooper Time Cube was a cool plugin that was one of the early kind of super short analog delays, acoustic delays that you can use for spreading things out. And that was described, was it maybe Joe Ciccarelli or Jim Scott who described that as being not great when it was the real analog unit, but the plug-in version is great and super useful. So, if it wasn't either you guys and somebody else, I apologize. but that's a great one. And then analog delays, tape delays, and things like that. These are all things that will help give you that quality sounding familiar and old school. Take a sip of my water, hang tight. And then I can't remember if it was in the original question, but you know, you're talking about investing in outboard gear. I think any of these things, if you're talking about the mix stage, I would look at, I'd look at getting a real console if you want to. That'll make a huge difference in sound. Getting a compressor to go across the two bus. Oh, you know what? I didn't put that on there. I apologize. I forgot to mention that you may want to come out of the console through a stereo compressor as well on the way to tape. So that would be one more part of the chain. I apologize. I had made notes of myself to do that initially, but I just forgot to actually write it in the bullet points there. But you might actually want to look at getting a real compressor to go out of your DAW through a real compressor and then come back in and print it on a pair of channels. That can be a really cool sound, and that can have a very real kind of awesome tone to it. So you might like that. But I also wanted to say that swapping out any of these plugins with something that you like, it doesn't have to be any of these. You could decide that you like your own thing. You could decide you'd like to have a Sans amp in there. You could decide that you like to do some of these vintage ones, but you like to have a really modern EQ in the tube, you know, the mix bus or on the individual tracks. But just trust your ears. When you find stuff you like, make a note of it and begin to find ways to, you know, consistently use those tools so that you can begin to get a signature sound of your own if you want to. But don't ever feel like you're stuck with anything too, because you can always experiment. Let's go to the next one. So this one comes in from Carl. Carl says, share some strategies on how to place the outside kick mic so that it adds depth and low end to the kick and complements the inside kick mic phase-wise. I like that word, phase-wise, and a smiley face. All right, great. So let's go to the answers to that. Some of them we've already talked about. With the inside mic, let's say you've got, I'm going to assume we've got a front head with a hole in it, because that's typically the scenario where we're going to use the inside mic and the outside one. Although you can use an outside mic even with just a single beater head on the drum. And you can use an inside mic even if you don't have a hole in the front head, because you can actually drop the mic in. Sometimes drums have a way to mount a mic inside it before you put the heads on, or they have a little hole at the top and you can drop a mic cable down and just dangle it inside the kick. That's a trick I've done before. But let's assume we've got a front head with a hole in it. You reach in and you get your inside mic. In my case, I use an AKG D112. And I tend to put that in the center of the drum pointing towards the beater. That's going to give you the most controlled, modern sound, and you're really going to hear the attack of the beater. If it's too attacky and you don't like it and you want to get a little bit more of the tone of the wood of the drum and some different harmonics and stuff, you can move the mic physically over toward the side. A lot of times if you're standing in front of the kick and you're looking at it, you know, you're not the drummer, you're out in front. The hole on the kick is usually to the right a little bit. And so I'll just move that inside mic over to the right towards the wood a little bit, and you can pick up a little bit more of that. But that's kind of a good starting place. And just listen to only that inside mic while you're placing the mic, and until you feel good about the way it sounds. And then the outside mic, I might start with it anywhere from like 4 or 5 inches from the front head. Sometimes I'll start up close, and it depends on what kind of thing you're going for. But often it gets moved back. I'll back it away from the kick drum, and I find I get a more focused, tighter drum sound with more low end, deepness to the drum as I move the mic back. I'm actually killing some of the proximity effect, and I'm killing some of the boominess by moving that outside mic back a bit. But you begin to hear it. It's like you'll hear that you're starting to get more natural air and tone to the kick drum, and it won't sound so unrealistically in your face. But one of the things that happens when you move that mic back is you got to watch out for the fact that if you were to back the outside mic away a foot, 2 feet from the kick, might sound great on just the kick drum, but now it's becoming a mic for the whole drum kit, and you're going to hear the toms and the cymbals and the snare drum in it and stuff like that. So just watch out for that, and be aware that as you do that, listen to the other drums. And then again, muting is a great tool for determining if there's a problem. Mute that outside kick drum and find out if all of a sudden, your snares and your toms sound better, and if you were maybe messing things up by having it out too far, because that can happen. If that does happen, if you're like, I've got to have my kick drum outside mic further away from the kick, but I've got to also not have so much snare and hi-hat and cymbals and other things in it, then feel free to use the blanket tricks, the make a kick tunnel. That's where you actually take like heavy blankets. You might have packing blankets for your studio. I highly recommend them. I'll show you pictures of that stuff in just a minute too. But that is a great way to create something where you have tunnels of blankets that go from the kick. You kind of tape it onto the outside of the kick drum, and then go over and above. You might take a couple of extra mic stands and kind of create this little robotic tunnel that allows you to drape a blanket out and then over the outside mic. You might not have to go around the back of the outside mic, but at least like what you're doing is you're creating a tunnel. It's almost like an expanding extension of the kick drum, so that if you were that outside mic at the far end of the tunnel, you couldn't look and see any of the other drums. All you could see was tunnel all the way to the kick drum, and that can help you direct the sound and sort of control what the bleed is. But just be aware that you're also now making the sound of a tunnel. So it's all a balancing act between how you do this stuff. But just feel free to use any kind of crazy trick and thing you can think of like that to try and control sound. If you don't like a sound coming into a mic, see if you can block that, put up something that blocks that mic to that particular sound, Like in Rockstars, the drums, you might have seen that I'll put a piece of foam between the hi-hat and the snare mic to literally block that hi-hat from getting into the snare mic sometimes. All right, so I skipped over this one quickly, but check the absolute phase polarity. So hit the polarity switch between the two kick mics. In my case, and I bet in yours, you're going to find that almost always it's correct. Like if you flip it, it sounds worse. And then you flip it back and you're like, I guess it was good to begin with. But it's good to check it, because sometimes it could be out. And the only reason it would be out in your case is probably because of something like the, if there's a wire that's miswired, where one mic pre is flipping the phase on the second mic kind of thing, that could cause them to be out of polarity. And you will want to check phase. That's something that we talk about in Rockstars of Drums. But I like to check the beater mic phase first against the overheads to make sure that I'm choosing the correct starting point for that mic. And then if you find that you flip the beater mic, well, then in that case, you might have to go and flip the outside mic too. So that's just something to think about. And then remember the whole subtractive EQ for the low end thing that I was talking about before, because that's a big part of getting those kicks to sound good. And you can use that on both the inside beater mic and on the outside mic, and that can really help tighten up the kick as a whole and make it sound better for you. All right, so now Darko sent in a wonderful bunch of extra questions too, so I'm going to jump into those too. These are Darko's bonus questions. Thanks, Darko. How to record kick that is having enough sub bass, and how to achieve tight kick sub. So let me answer that. We've already talked about that to a certain level, and also we're going a full hour here, so it looks like I'm going to go over. So I hope you guys don't mind. More the merrier. But I added some more things to say about that. So choose the right mic. When I'm thinking about sub, I'm thinking about the front head of the kick drum as a place where you're trying to maybe capture sub too. A mic is going to have a lot of low end from the proximity, and when you do that subtractive EQ trick, again, I talk about it here, subtractive EQ to remove boxiness and lumpy low mids, that's automatically going to enhance the sub quality of the kick drum as you begin to bring it back up in volume. It's also going to bring out the beater sound as you bring it up in volume. It's going to just help that a lot. What I was saying about this is if you're trying to choose a mic that's got sub on the front head, there is actually a sub kick mic. And what that is a trick that's been done for a long time, where you take an NS10 woofer, which is the white speaker of a Yamaha NS10 speaker, and you dangle that, you hang that in front of the kick drum, or you mount it on something rigid right in front of the kick drum, or you just literally put the whole speaker in front of the kick drum, and then you wire the direct output of just that white cone. So you're not trying to come out of the whole speaker, because the actual Yamaha speaker has a crossover network in it, and you're not trying to go through all that stuff. But when you just have that cone and you wire that, you go down to a 1/4 inch guitar jack, you plug that into a DI box, and then you come out of the DI box on a mic cable and into your mic line and straight into a mic pre and turn that up. Now you've got this speaker recording of the kick drum that's bringing out just low end. It's just this soft, puffy, deep tone of the kick, and that's called a sub kick, and that can give you some subs. I actually don't think of that as the real subs. I think of real subs as like getting a condenser mic out away from the kick drum a little bit, or just getting the kick to really sing in the room, so that actually a Coles 4038 ribbon mic has an incredible bass response, not to be up close to a kick, but when you get it out into the room where the sweet spot and you're really hearing the low end resonance of a kick drum is, that can bring out a huge deep kick drum sub resonance. But that's the point at which you want to have a mic that's out away from the kit that really is capable of picking up the low frequency. A 57's, not going to go that deep. I don't know what the cutoff is, but I'm sure it's pretty low. But, I'm thinking of like a condenser mic that really gets the deep lows, or a ribbon mic like the Coles 4038 that really picks up huge deep low end. And then you just find the right spot for it out in front of the kick drum. In the Coles example, I'm going to say that I've done stuff where I found a great low end spot where we were parking it on the 3rd step from the upper loft of the studio, coming down the spiral staircase. And I remember doing one of my first sessions like that, and actually the band just walked around until he was like, "Man, it sounds killer right here where the kick drum is. Let's put a mic here." And I was like, "Great!" So we took advantage of that. That was a great low end on it. Or if I'm putting a microphone out in front of the front head of the kick, again, I'll use a condenser mic like I showed you in the videos of Rockstars of Drums. I might use my AKG 414. I might try one of those mini K47s, or the Roswell Delphos microphone. I've got Lewitt mics that would sound great on that, the 640 LCTs. And many others. Even the Mic Tech C7 would be a good choice out front. But you very likely, if you got a condenser, you want to make sure it's got a pad on it, because it's going to be pretty high volume if you're close to the drum kit and the drummer's rocking out. So those are some considerations. Make sure you don't have the low cut on there, because you're actually going to shave off the low end, but that should help. Another question to ask yourself is, who gets the subs? Is it the bass or the kick? There's a lot of times where I don't want the kick drum to be a deep sub bass. And if you go study hip hop music, you'll notice that there's a lot of production where there is no bass guitar necessarily. Maybe it's just the kick itself. The 808 is taking the job of both having the attack of a kick drum, but it's also the sustain and the long note of the bass itself. And the reason why there's no bass guitar there is because that would just fill up all the space. So there's not that much room down there in the lows for both the kick and the bass, and you got to be really creative and selective about how you add them up together to get a unified sound where it's like you don't have two things trying to do the same thing in the same frequency. It's just a consideration. I mean, there are incredible tracks. I'm a big fan of like Deadmau5 and EDM, where I hear productions that somehow seem to make a huge kick and a huge bass all go, and it's all huge together, and I'm still trying to figure it out. So just use your ears on that, make your best guess, and don't worry about what is happening in somebody else's production. Worry about what's happening in your production, because that's the one that counts right now. All right, so be careful how much sub you add. There are plugins that will add sub, like the Waves, R-Bass. What's some other ones I'm using? The CLA plugin from Waves has a great, kick, the drum plugin, and you can add subs to the kick or to the bass, and it can sound really cool at first when you're checking it out in your studio. But even in my studio with the subwoofer and it's pretty dialed in, it's easy for me to quickly and easily overdo it and have way too much subs going on. And by the time I take it out to the car and give it a listen out there and listen to some other environments, I quickly realize I'm like, oh wow, I completely overshot it, so I need to back that down. When you have way too much lows and subs in your mix, you're going to notice that you're getting a ton of distortion if you try and turn your mix up. Places I hear distortion, you're just going to either hear flat out distortion on the whole mix or on the bass. Sometimes I feel like I notice it in the vocal. So I notice that like I'm trying to crank this mix, and the vocal is sounding like it's got a fuzzy distortion in the low end to it, because it's actually the whole mix is distorting just from the subs that are in there. So that's the thing. You got to check it in all those places and make sure. You may not really need, let me think about it. There was an example with Brian Bass Gardner was mastering a record that I was producing with the Living Things. And we were at Bernie Grumman's mastering in LA. And we talked about wanting to be able to crank up this record we were doing and make sure it rocked. And the first thing he did was he said like, all right, let's do this. And he just went and he put a low cut and he just shaved off everything below 20 hertz. You don't think of 20 hertz as being in that audio range necessarily, but it is in the reproduction range, and it is going out in the digital world. And, you will feel that on some systems, depending on what you're doing. But for rock and roll, if you want to be able to crank it up loud, that was a lesson I learned from him, that you don't, that's not where the music is for that stuff. And so it actually was able to turn it up louder and crank up the mix if that was just removed in the mastering stage. So just be aware that just because there's a plugin that allows you to add a bunch of subs and lows doesn't mean that you musically need it for the style of music you're doing at that moment. All right, next question from Darko. How do you know that specific room hall will be good for recording drums? I'm going to interpret that as meaning an acoustic space. And then how do you treat it if it's not good for drums? When is enough acoustic treatment and when is too much? So those are great questions. Really an answer to that is you practice and you learn, you try it, and then you discover that it's not working later. And so, the more you record in the same space, the more opportunity you have to begin to know it and adjust and get a feel for how much of everything you need. But there are some things that will help you out to approaching things and starting out in new environments. So first thing you do is you go into the space and you just listen to it and just see if it feels cool to you, if you like the sound of it acoustically. You can do the tried and true method that everybody does, and you go and you clap your hands and you, listen to that reverb, listen to that tail, whatever. But that won't necessarily tell you what drums sound like in there. But hitting a snare drum will help. So if you hit a snare drum in that space, that's going to tell you pretty quickly what it's going to sound like in there. And it's going to give you a sense of how live the space is and whether it's, sounding great to you or sounding kind of crazy or whatever. And, it might inform the drum part. The liveness of the room might inspire the drummer to play a certain kind of way, and that could be a great thing. But you might be trying to go for a certain kind of record or a certain kind of sound, and the room really doesn't feel right to you, or it doesn't seem to be the right kind of thing that you would want. I will say if it sounds bad in there, then it's likely to be bad. But I'll also say a couple of other things. So it's easier to remove room than it is to add it acoustically. So what I mean by that is if you're in a room where it's too reverberant, it's easier to tone that down and remove some of that reverb than it is to put reverb into a room that's sounding dead already. And I just mean that acoustically. That is because you can jump forward to this, and I'll come back to the next one above it here in a sec. But you can always add stuff like add heavy blankets and treatments to the space. You could put more stuff in there. You can put more people in there. You can put more furniture and couches if it's a big enough space. And you can put panels around the drums. And all those things will soak up some of that live room quality that's going into the close mics of the drums and help tighten it up. So that'll make a big difference as you do that. And you really kind of need to let yourself experiment. Hear the drums without any blankets around it, and then listen to the way it's sounding, and then go bring in some blankets and do what I'm about to show you, where you put them on T stands to kind of tighten up the space around the drums, and listen to the difference. Don't bring on all your blankets at once. Just bring in a couple. How's that sound? Sounds pretty good. All right, great. Let's bring in some more, like kind of overdo it now. And then listen, you're like, oh yeah, it's kind of sounding too dead, it sounded better before. So that's a good thing. And you can treat rooms. That's why I say it's easier to like tone down the reverb and liveness of a space than it is to liven it up in reverse. If you have a room that's too dead already, and it doesn't have any reverb, you could actually bring in wood panels, sheets of plywood or hardwoods or veneer and things like that, and liven it up. I actually haven't done that much. I haven't had to do that. I've always had to do the reverse, have something that's too live and try and deaden it. But that is something you could try out if you're starting out with the space that's not right. One last thing I want to say about treating spaces is if you're in small spaces for your home studio recordings, more often than not, you're dealing with a room that really just acoustically doesn't sound right because of the modal resonances of the room, because there's actually a tone to the space. And in those cases, the blankets aren't going to help cut down the reverb so much. They might help, but you need more bass trapping is what you're looking for. So you may want to see if there's a way to stick in a couch or an overstuffed chair or, huge piles of blankets in a corner, that kind of stuff. You're not trying to cover all the walls so much as you're trying to soak up all the low end and the low mids that are in that space. I don't know. It might be weird to, you might have to cover it up, but just like, a big roll of pink insulation, as long as that's not getting on anybody, that kind of stuff would act as bass traps in corners and stuff like that. So then let me jump to this next comment. So it's easier in the mix stage to actually add room to a dead recording than the reverse. So when you're mixing, if you got too much reverb in your recording from this initial one, because let's say you didn't treat it well enough, you didn't bring enough panels and it's too echoey, too roomy, then it's harder for you to remove that room at the mix stage from that recording. You end up doing things like, well, I'll just have to lean on the close mics and not use the room mics. But even the close mics can be picking up the room around it and the space around it. And you really notice that when you go in and treat this stuff. You notice those close mics sound more like close mics and less like they're picking up the walls, the neighboring walls and stuff. But it is as easy to add room if the drums aren't live enough, because you've got plugins that will do reverb and room emulation and all that kind of stuff. So that's just a reminder. All right, so now let's talk about T-stands. So this is a simple design where you take a microphone stand and you have it upright, and then you take the boom and you go halfway instead of all the way extended, and then you just come down at a 90, and you end up with something that looks like a standing T. And you can just take heavy blankets and hang it right over the mic stand. That's a quick and dirty way to put treatment around a drum kit or anything else in the studio to deaden the space. So here's some examples, some photos that I thought I'd share with you, for both from my studio and from my hay bale studio down at Bonnaroo, where I do that quite often. I also will bring out panels, but a lot of times I just do these blankets because it's such a quick and easy way to do it. So you notice here is the studio. You see there's a the drum kit and this mic stand, but right inside this blanket is a drum stand that's going up, and then it's got an angled T boom there. And then the blanket, these heavy packing blankets, which you can just find on eBay and Amazon. These ones were like 20 bucks a piece or something when I bought them. And I remember getting about 6 of them, and they've lasted me for years and years, been super useful, and been, you know, plenty of blankets to have around for a session. You just hang it over this stand. So it's going just as low on the other side, draping down. And then you see another angle, different session, but same approach. You can easily get 2 of these in here. That tightens up the drum kit sound, and it also prevents the drums from leaking through to what other instruments were going on inside the session here. And then up here at Bonnaroo, same thing. I put 2 or 3 of these, making a wall around the drum kit, and over to the right is where there would be the rest of the band in the room. And that just totally tightens up the drums, keeps the drums from bleeding into other instruments, and really helps control the sound. Now, this room itself was already super dead, so we didn't really need to deaden down the drums anymore, but it ends up sounding great anyway, so pretty cool. And then here, I'm actually going to stop screen sharing and go back to video for 1 sec. Give me a sec while I do this, and I'm going to show you. Hey, Rockstars, I'm going to show you a panel. This is a super cheap panel you can build in your studio. This is about as cheap as it gets. These ones were $5 a piece, I think, when I built them. So this is a 2x4 sheet from Home Depot. It's like this hard press wood, so it's rigid, and it gives you the structure. And then on this side of it, you can't see it, but there is also a 2x4 sheet of Owens Corning 703 1-inch insulation right here. So I just lay the sheet of insulation on top of this board. It's the same size, fits on there just fine. It's a perfect match. And then I bought totally the least expensive burlap I could get at a fabric store. You can get this in huge sheets of it. They just sell you a roll, and then you cut it down to size. And I would cut the burlap out a little bit bigger than this. Now, one thing about burlap is you do need to be aware. I think I bought some fire treatment spray, and I sprayed these before I put it up. And I also put burlap in another room because I wanted to make sure that it was safe. But and I also actually lit it on fire to check it out, and I think it just like smoldered a little bit. So it was a pretty good choice. It didn't seem like it was going to be a dangerous choice or anything like that. But you just cut the burlap, you come over, and then fold it. And then I just took a staple gun. You just staple all along there. It's not gorgeous looking, but it was dirt cheap, and it's super effective. And then here's the real trick. See this? These are 2 loops. I just took a loop of extra burlap, or you can take a sheet or whatever, and you staple it on there. And now I have 2 loops. And now this can be what goes on that T stand. So I can have the mic stand come up through here and then go crossways. And then I just come slide it on this part of the mic stand, slide it on that. And now I've got one hanging on the T. And you can just turn this and face this towards anything. And that makes it really easy to get this panel, to get that panel up high. If you're doing other recordings in your studio and you've got like a vocal session and you've got panels and you want to set them up high, you know, those T's can go up higher, or you can set them down low around the drum kit. So cool little trick. I just wanted to show you my panels. So go make yourself some panels for $5. All right, here we go. See if I can go back to my screen share. All right, groovy. Next one. Thanks for bearing with me, Rockstars. All right, so this is another one from Darko. It says, what to look for in perfect snare close mic recording. Which sonic part will come from close microphone, which part from overheads, and what from room mic in a final mix. All right, so I've got a few answers for that. First of all, I'm still looking for the perfect snare sound. No, but you will be surprised. Sometimes snares sound really great in the mic, and sometimes they don't sound as great as you thought they might sound. But it doesn't mean you can't get a great snare sound in the end. So you need to ask: is this for dead drums or live drums? So if it's a dead drum situation like what I have in my my phone booth when I record drums in there, then I'm really leaning on the close mics, and it's all about that sound. And I really have to EQ the snot out of them. I'll really boost the high end on a snare, and I'll gate it, and I'll give it, a real like, when you hit it, it's just like right in your face, but then it goes away. And same thing with the kick. I won't necessarily gate the toms that way in there, but I will gate the kick and the snare and try and get a really tight sound. And in that case, it's all about the close mic. You got to like get the sound great like that. And then you use some of the overhead a little bit too, but you're really just close micing everything. If it's live drums, then you're really wanting the drums to sing out in the room, and the close mic might have less to do with the sound. So for live drums, you may want to make sure that your overheads and your room mics are really kind of giving you the big picture of what the drums sound like, and then you're just sneaking in some of that close mic to get just enough detail on it. And there are a lot of times where I record the snare with a 57, and it sounds great in the mix when I get everything done, but then I go solo the 57, I listen to it and I'm like, man, that sounds all, that sounds dull. That doesn't sound all that exciting by itself. But without that close mic in there, it's missing just enough of the body of the snare in the mix that it sounds lacking. So in those cases, the perfect snare sound might be just trying to add the thing that's not present in your overheads or not present in your ambient and room mics. So it kind of depends on which sound you're going for. So that, I hope that helps a little bit. As far as snares, for getting a perfect snare sound, you want to definitely check that the top mic and the bottom mic are in phase polarity. They're phase coherent. So you have to hit the flip switch and flip phase on it to make sure that you've picked the right phase. I will start with the top mic and I'll check that against my overheads to make sure that that mic's in phase with the overhead, so that I'm starting from a great place. And then I will check the bottom mic against that and make sure that that one is phase coherent to the top mic. As far as what I do when I'm tracking, I always run my snare top through my CalRec, which has EQ, because I pretty much know I want to just give it a little bit of brightening. I just want to like excite it and liven it up just a little bit, but not too much, and I'll try and get that to sound as good as it can. When I go mix, I almost always end up like reaching for more EQ and brightening up the top, and not always and not all the time, but I definitely try it. I'll definitely like see how far I can push it and what the effect is on the drum mix and see if I like it that way or not. So I feel like in my experience, I never get the perfect snare sound while recording it, but I try to get the perfect sound by the time I'm done recording it and mixing it, if that answers that question. Also, try not to compress when recording. I talked about that earlier. I don't put a compressor on the snare drum when I'm recording it because I don't want to tie my hands with what is possible later. I don't want to overcommit, bleed from other drums. I don't want to overcompress it and take the life out of it. I may actually get more transient punch that I can bring out in the mix if I take it straight, clean, right into, the DAW as I'm recording it, or right to tape. What was I going to say? Also, oh shoot, I had something I was going to share about that. I guess that was it. Just don't overcompress it. Don't compress the snare mic if you can help it. Oh, I know what I was going to say. Sometimes I do compress the snare mic. Sorry. The reason I might compress the snare mic is because sometimes I'm recording drums where they're doing like a train shuffle or brushes or something like that, and they're doing quiet stuff and they're hitting the backbeat on the snare. And in that case, if the drums just simply aren't sounding like the right drum groove because I'm not hearing enough of the quiet stuff, then I'll compress while I'm recording to control the backbeat of the snare, the louder hits, such that it allows me to just bring all the snare stuff forward, and then it feels more right. And, in that case, I'm making decisions like that during tracking because, say the band is all listening and it has to sound right to them too. And I want to make sure that that everything's feeling right. So those are times where I'll compress the snare, is when it's something that tends to be a quieter song or there's a train shuffle beat going on. Again, for mic choice, you can't go wrong with an SM57 on top and bottom. Those are great choices for rock, for most snare recordings. I do have guests that on the show that think that's a terrible idea and they'd much rather have a high fidelity mic as their mic choice on a snare. That's up to you. I've tried all kinds of stuff. I've tried taping a 451 AKG along with a 57, and that can sound kind of cool. But in the end, I mean, like, really, most records I've done that I've really liked, the results, I've had a 57 on top and bottom. A 57 will probably need some EQ. You probably will need to brighten it. You probably will need to EQ a little bit of the body into the low end if you want. And again, like I was saying with dead drums, the close mic is where you're going to get the punch of the drum. That's where you're really going to get the drum sticking out of the mix, that gated like sound that comes way out. Ambient mic. So if you have a mic that's placed out in front of the drum kit, you could just go walk out in front of your drum kit, listen to a drummer play, and stand. You're like, where do I want to stand to listen to this drums rock out? If it's too loud, again, put on your earmuffs, put in your earplugs, but go stand somewhere where you're like, this feels like fucking rock and roll. Sorry for swearing, guys. This feels like rock and roll as I'm listening to this. And so this is a good place. Put a mic there. Put an ambient power mic out there. That's what I call it, the power mic. And if you do the right thing, if you find a good sweet spot, that can be the mic that gives you the power of the mid-range of the snare drum. So I find that a lot of times that's where I get the rock power. I know I'm saying that on the next one, but that's where I get the mid-range, like, excitement out of the snare drum on a rock track. It's not from the close mic when somebody's playing loud. It's a little further out from the kit. And then the room mics are a place where you get that big bombastic power. And, you can really try some different stuff with your room mics. In my case, I like to use them up over the loft in my studio because they both sound great and that's an easy place to put them. But, I could just as easily try experimenting some more. I could put them, 10 feet out in front of the kit. I could put them much further depending on the song and the style and the player. But a great story from Steve Albini, who was recording In Utero, and he talked about how Dave Grohl was hitting the drums. He's a really powerful hitter. And I remember him saying that he almost didn't use the overheads at all in that case, and that he really was able to just rely on the room mics for the drums for all the power and bigness of those drums. And that, the close mics just give you some more detail in that picture. But that's an interesting way to think about it. Think about your room mics as the big power, or if you just simply want your drums to not be up close while you're listening, but be further back. You need to think about it as far as your sound stage too. Like, where do you want all these instruments to be? And that'll help you know what kind of mics to lean on. If you really want to focus on everybody up front and the drums are supposed to be supportive, but not clamoring for attention, then maybe you do want to just lean on your room mics. All right, so this is last question. This one comes in from Alec, and he talked about a really important thing, which is to just be able to quickly make a decision on mic placement while standing in front of the drummer and hearing half of a run through of a song. So I think that's a great vision. I think that's an important consideration. You want to be able to make the right choice, right? That's the whole point of going through Rockstars of Drums, is to feel more empowered to make the right decision as you go into this, so that you at least have more, colors on your palette that you can choose from when you make a decision. I think the first thing you do is you listen to the drummer, you listen to the music, and you think about the style of the production and the style of the song. And you start with a choice that kind of matches that style in terms of the vision of where you want this whole finished thing to go. So that means, like, if this is a big modern rock production, then you probably want to lean on a big modern rock multi-miking. So you probably want 11 to 13 mics on a drum kit, depending on how many drums you've got too. And you probably want to have a lot of those choices so that you can really push and pull all those details as needed until you get the right sound. But also a reminder that whole stand where the drums sound great to you thing, that will help you know whether you need to lean on your room mics or whether everything's going to be cool just up close, And if a drummer's really beating the drums hard and loud, and your instinct is to back away from the drums, then maybe that's where the drums belong in your final mix. And maybe you need to make sure that you have killer sounding room mics or killer sounding ambient mics so that sound is appropriate for the final production. If the drummer's playing quiet or there's a lot of detail stuff, or it's really tight as a part, then maybe you find yourself wanting to get closer to the drums so that they sound tighter. If the drum part is quick and there's a lot of short, like, you don't want a snare that goes because it's not going to sound right for the part, right? And that's when you bring in the blankets and you start encasing it around the drums, and you're really relying on those overhead drums. Or maybe maybe the music sounds more like an old Who recording, and you're like, well, Glyn Johns did that stuff, so why don't I use the Glyn Johns style, because that worked for those productions and we'll make that work for this, or when I think about the recorder man and the Lidge man technique, I also think about those as being appropriate for, for me, it's something I'd do if I wanted to be a little more indie rock and just whatever that sound means to me. I guess it means a less of a big produced sound. So I might lean on those mic techniques so that I arrive at that kind of production sound later. So really just, let the style of your miking match the production style that you're going for. So remember, loud stuff, you want to back away from it. Your mics want to back away. Quiet is up close and detailed, and you want to get your mics up close too. When I'm doing the Coles mic as a mono overhead over drums, there's many times where somebody's been playing like a detailed sound. The Silver Seas, those records I did with those guys, David Gerke would play some really great, like, detailed parts, and he's really precise about it and everything. And so I'd actually bring the mic down a whole lot closer, because I wanted to, I might bring down the mic so close that there's no way you can play a big rock fill because it's in your way as you're going for the toms. But if the part is never going to play a big giant rock fill, well, then bring the mic down close so that you're getting that detail, and you can hear it in the speakers. You're like, it gives the effect of bringing the drums forward and closer to you while you're listening in the control room. And if that was what you were wanting out of the drum kit, then making the mics go closer to the drums is the same thing as taking those drums and the speakers and bringing them closer to you as you're listening. Hope that helps as an understanding too. And again, you can get away with miking it up in a bizarre fashion if it's not in the way of the part. And if the part doesn't require anything, bombastic hand movements, but more detailed, smaller stick movements, then it's easier to bring the overheads down closer. Then the other thing is, when you're sound checking, make sure to, kind of go through this process of sound checking quickly, because I'm looking for phase. I'm looking for, generally speaking, what each of these sounds is. Just listening maybe to balance of the instruments and the mics on a certain level, but each song is different. So as soon as you go to that song, you're probably going to need to change things. And in that point, you will want to be able to make adjustments to accommodate all these different changes and different sounds. And so that's the point at which you really listen to the part. And that's the point at which you start moving mics closer and further away. You start saying, oh, I've got a stereo pair of overheads, but the balance isn't right, because when he goes to play this part, I'm losing this instrument, or this one's too loud, or whatever. That's the time to really think about that stuff. So just remember that your initial sound check is like down and dirty, but you need to re-sound check at the beginning of each song if you can, depending on your session and whether there's room for that, to make sure that you're really getting the best thing for that recording. So that's it for Rockstars of Drums. Rockstars, if you have any questions now, feel free to ask them. Jim Patrick, I don't know if you're still with us right now, but jump in with your question. Otherwise, I will see you guys in Recording Studio Rockstars. thanks so much for watching. You guys rock. It's a pleasure to hang with you. Again, if you have any more questions about recording drums, whether it's recording, editing, or mixing, feel free to ask within Rockstars of Drums. You can just use the question bar, the chat area, and you can just drop your question in there. I'll get a notice about it. Or you can email me directly at lidge@recordingstudiorockstars.com or rsrockstars.com. And then let me know, how it's going for you. I want to hear how your drum recordings are turning out. Feel free to send me any of your stuff. And thanks for being here. You're a rock star. Cheers. See you guys around the studio.